That's not how people interact with credit cards. You can use a little bit more common sense and stop creating a painful administrative process for everyone. Inappropriate financial habits and make poor decisions.
So that's why it has such a big impact on your borrowing power, because they're assuming you're going to use it in basically the worst way possible for your finances.
Ever made a subtle change to your circumstances and wondered, how does this actually impact my borrowing power? How does it impact my financial position? And what does it mean for me financially? We find that life has a lot of changes and people regularly make different changes to their circumstances, like getting a credit card, adding in a personal loan, buying a car, perhaps having another child. These things happen and we want to make it easier for you to work out how this changes your borrowing power on your own. So in this episode, we're going to go through 8 different circumstances and unpack what they mean for your borrowing power. Kurt, how are you?
Yeah, excited because this one is a lot of the conversations I have day to day with people is like, cool, something's just happened in my life, either for better or worse. And I want some updated numbers on what I can now borrow compared to what I could before.
Yeah, exactly. We've tried to keep this very simple. So we've done it for your owner-occupier borrowing power. So when you want to go buy a home, what impact does this change have to that number? That is what we are going to simplify it to. It's a little bit harder to give you what it does to your investment borrowing power.
More interactions.
Yeah, there's just a few more interactions. It depends on the yield that you're purchasing, your tax rates, a whole range of things. So just to keep it simple, we're just going to run through a few different scenarios. So let's get into it.
Yeah, perfect. So first one, credit cards.
Credit cards.
So this is a common one. Anyone trying to stretch their borrowing power, closing credit cards is often the easiest way to get a bit of bang for your buck.
Yep.
Simple calc, you got a 10K credit card limit. It's probably costing you about 50K in borrowing power.
Wow.
So
that sucks.
That sucks. So close it.
Can you unpack why?
Yeah. So when banks run the credit cards through the servicing calculator, they're looking at the limit that you have, not the actual amount of balance or spending that you put through the card. So they kind of assume a worst case scenario that if you've got a 10K limit, you're going to rack up 10K of credit card debt and you're just going to make the minimum repayments on it and just pay interest the whole time. So they're not looking at it being like, oh, you clear it every month, don't worry about it kind of thing. They're focused on the limit because technically, I guess that's what you could do if you have bad financial habits. So they're looking at worst case scenario. So that's why it has such a big impact on your borrowing power, because they're assuming you're going to use it in basically the worst way possible for your finances.
Yep. Anyone at APRA, if there's anyone who listens to this, just fix that. That's so stupid. That's not how people interact with credit cards. You can use a little bit more common sense and stop creating a painful administrative process for everyone. Lots of people have healthy circumstances and use credit cards for points for the 30 to 55 day interest-free period and use it as prudent financial management. They're not going to go, rack up $10,000, $20,000 credit card limits. And if they haven't done it for the last few years, then isn't that evidence enough? So I'm just going to put this down to the reason why they do this is because the regulator is just being
forces them to
pain in the ass, basically. They're just being stupid. Sounds like a regulator being a regulator without actually working out what people actually do. Being prudent people don't go and do this. You don't need to go punish 90% of Australians because 10% of Australians have inappropriate financial habits and make poor decisions. So when they go and get a loan, we find that people have to cut up their credit cards regularly now to get that additional borrowing power, which just creates an administrative pain for people and offers no real financial stability benefits. So yeah,
That's your pitch for that one?
I'm going to add in a little note here and stand up for property people all across the country being like, this is stupid. Come on. Wake up and, fix it. That's basically it.
Yeah, maybe It is stupid, but it's costing you 50K. So, as of today, it is what it is.
Yeah, it is. That is the policy today. And in the past, there were some flexible rules around it if you could show that you've paid off your credit cards, but that doesn't really apply anymore. They will just simply take it. Using some numbers in there, they take about 3.6% of the monthly expense that goes through. So if you have a 10K credit card, that's $360 a month. So in every borrowing power calculation and underpinning all of these calculations that we're going through, banks calculate your borrowing power by getting your net income, how much money goes into your bank account after you've paid your taxes every month. They subtract your expenses and whatever's left over, they can extrapolate to work out how much can you afford to repay a loan at with your leftover monthly income. So credit cards increase your expenses, which reduces the amount of leftover money you have. and therefore reduces your borrowing power. And that $360 per month, you won't actually feel, doesn't actually go out of your bank account, but it does go into the assumed expenses banks take.
Yeah, quick top tip on credit cards.
Yes.
Charge cards are treated differently.
Ooh.
So credit cards, blanket rule, basically every bank treats them the same.
Yep.
But we've had this question a bit recently, so there must be some cool charge card product out there that people are trying to use.
You're the credit card user, you'll know, man.
Yeah. But if you have a charge card, which has no limit, but you're required to pay it in full every month, some banks kind of treat it a bit like a credit card, but there are other lenders that will treat it almost as basically part of your living expenses. So if you're trying to have a credit card or have some kind of a card product, but not have it impact your borrowing power, then you can look into charge cards because the rules are a little bit more open there, and banks will treat it, some banks at least, will treat it a bit more favorably.
Wow.
So if it's super important to you, have a look at that.
Yes. And if you go with the right lenders as well.
Yes.
Because some lenders, depending on your finance strategy, could block you out completely and make it much more difficult and look at the actual expenses you pay, right? And then be like, hey, look.
It's because pros and cons, but like that is a part of the credit card world that's not treated with the same blanket rule.
Yes. Awesome. Let's go through help debts, student debts. This one's a very, very common one. I also don't like this. So, I'm going to have another pitch at the regulator here. Help debts, how do they impact your borrowing power?
Yeah, so for most people, quite significantly. Actually, the last person I spoke to about this was last night, and this guy had a $300K change in borrowing power as if he wanted to close his help. But basically...
$200K plus income.
Yes, he was a high income earner. And
Doctor?
it was investment debt. No, like investment banker, actually.
Oh,
Anyway, basically, they will look at your income.
Yes.
Some banks will take your total income, so like potential rental income, your global income. Other banks will just take your salary income. But they're basically looking at your income and then they're calculating based on the HEX repayment threshold for this financial year, what is your annual/monthly repayment that you're going to have to make to the ATO. For HEX, and they are going to deduct that off your, they're going to include that as an expense, basically, not deduct it off your salary. They're going to include it as an expense post-tax. That's how they treat it. They don't look at your HEX balance. So if you've got $200K left to go and you've completed a medical degree and your ages from paying off your HEX, or if you've got $3,000 left and you're literally like one tax return away from paying it off, bank doesn't care. If there's an active HEX debt, they're just looking at the repayment, the monthly repayment based on your income bracket and where you sit in the HEX repayment tables. So that's kind of how they treat it. Again, it sucks because it's a bit inflexible, and normally it means if you have small HEX balances, you can get good bang for your buck closing it. If you've got big HEX balances, then it's a bit trickier. But let's run through some of the actual borrowing power numbers for different levels.
Yes. So if you make $75K in income, how does this impact your borrowing power?
Yeah, so you would fall into like a $2.5K monthly repayment. I think
yearly.
Yeah, sorry, $2.5K yearly repayment. And then that's going to be a $30K borrowing power reduction, basically, if the HEX is sitting there.
Yep. That ends up being quite large. Like, it's going to end up being like 10%, 15% of your total borrowing power, because, if you're making $75K, you're probably borrowing, $300,000 in that sort of...
Yeah, and this is something for investors in particular that we model out fairly regularly, is like if you're sitting on a 5K HEX balance and you get a 30K borrowing power boost, then it might be worth using 5K of your deposit funds to close the HEX, get the borrowing power up. But if you've got a 60K HEX debt, then like you don't want to close it because you're going to give up 60K and only get 30K back in borrowing power. So different for different circumstances. But that's on a 75K income. And then as we go up the income thresholds, the borrowing power impact is going to be higher. So
do you want to go through a few of them just to give everyone clarity?
Yeah. So 100K income, that's going to be about a 65K reduction in borrowing power. 150 income, about a 150K reduction in borrowing power.
Whoa.
200 income is like a 250 reduction in borrowing power. So obviously you don't want to disclose the guy I was chatting to yesterday, but he was slightly above that. So you can kind of reverse engineer his income.
Yeah.
And then just a little bit of a ridiculous example, but like at a 500K income, it's a 600K reduction in borrowing power.
I had a lawyer like this once. Like, I was just like, he was a friend of mine, and my conversation was like, bro, I got some weird news for you. It's like, he was in the legal field and he ran his own business. So he was doing really well for himself. And he had he had a really good income and he had like a $900,000 impact on his borrowing power. And he asked me, he'd be like, can you check that again? That doesn't make any sense. And then I had to explain to him how it worked. We worked through it with the bank and found a solution to it. But that was a crazy, crazy scenario where the higher your income is, the greater
the more you're punished.
The punishment is to your borrowing power calculator. So the one thing to add here is with help debt repayments, as your income scales up, the percentage of your income that you are repaying to the government also scales up. As you get past 150 odd thousand, I think you're paying around 11% of your total income back to the government to repay your help debt. So that percentage change is scaling as your income rises. Now I'm going to add in a little bit of a defense for all the young Australians here who have gone to uni and now want to buy a house. Come on, make it a little bit easier. It's so hard. Like, do we need to make it harder for people and punish people who go to university? Look, I understand this one. This one makes a bit more sense from the regulator. It does, because technically that ain't money that goes into their bank account. So you're asking the banks to lend money when someone doesn't actually earn the money or it's not going in their net income. So yeah, the regulator's got a point here, but at the same time, this is just a societal type change where it's just like, do we really need to punish someone who's gone to university, who's likely going to have income increases over time and can also show that they're going to have their help debt repaid over a 2, 3, 4 year window? Perhaps there's some flexibility here. Maybe you could say, I'm going to have my help debt paid off over 5 years. So let's have a smaller impact on your borrowing power, or not include it in your borrowing power because you're writing 30-year loans. And we're going to take some assumptions here based on your circumstances of being a young Australian. You'll find a way to pay this off. There needs to be a little bit more help for younger Australians here because borrowing power conditions are so tight at the moment, where particularly in Sydney, you earn 100 grand, you can't buy an apartment now. Like, you're really, really struggling to go buy an apartment. But you've gone to uni, you've done well, you've been an associate for a couple of years, you might be a lawyer, accountant, and without help from mum and dad, you can't buy an apartment because they're taking away, what is this? $65,000. They're taking away 15% of your borrowing power to go buy an apartment. Like, it's a bit unfair.
It is a bit unfair.
It just doesn't work at the moment. So it's more of an anomaly of high rates and high assessment rates, and younger Australians are just being fed out of the market, which means loans are for the rich people or rich income earners, which another way to put that in is loans are not for young Australians anymore. Like, they're making it harder and harder.
Yeah.
And this policy makes it harder and harder. So APRA, fix this too. I hope someone's listening from APRA. I don't know if anyone is, but
I feel like this might be a common theme for everything that reduces borrowing power as we go through these. But yeah, on HEX, I would just say depending on what you're trying to do, like I mentioned, and how much cash you have available and how much is left on your HEX balance, like the most common conversation and kind of modeling that we do is trying to work out, okay, if you spend 10K to clear your HEX and it generates a 50K increase in your borrowing power, maybe that's a good trade-off. Yep. If you're having to close 60K of HEX, but you're only getting a 20K borrowing power increase, then it's a waste of time. So everyone's circumstance will be a bit different. It can make sense to close it, and closing your HEX is quite easy. So if you're buying, it's something that you can get a pre-approval with the HEX to be closed at the time of purchase. So you can kind of work out what the best way to do it is. And then you only actually have to pull the trigger on it when you actually purchase.
Yep. Awesome advice there. Let's go through salary income. This one, everyone has, or most people have. What happens when you get a 10 grand pay rise? It's July. A lot of people get pay rises in July. Yep. We're getting a lot of emails. I saw a few
tax cuts.
Last week. Yeah, tax cuts.
We've run through those before. But if rather than a net change in your income, just a gross change, you get a pay bump.
So what happens if I got a $10,000 a year pay rise?
Yeah.
How is this different from salary income in general?
Yeah. So you get potentially up to a 75K increase in borrowing power. Woo-hoo. It'll depend a little bit on where you are in the marginal tax bracket. So if you're adding, say you're a couple and you're adding a second income where previously, your partner wasn't working and then they add 10K, that gives you the biggest boost because effectively... it's like a zero. It's it's below the tax-free threshold, right? So that gives you the biggest boost. Yep. But if you're at the top marginal rate and you add 10K, then 60. Your multiplier is going to be a fair bit lower. Like you might be looking at a 50K, like a 5-to-1 multiple, 4.5-to-1 multiple. Yep. Something like that. So, somewhere between 10K salary increase, depending on where you sit in the spectrum, you're probably looking at somewhere between a 45K to 75K income borrowing power increase depending on, like I say, where you are in the tax brackets.
Yep, sure. There's one more thing I'd add to this is a really, really soft way to work out how much you can borrow. This isn't an appropriate way to calculate it, but if you've got a very clean scenario, a 5 times gross income is a very, very off-the-cuff measurement. So if you get paid 200 grand between you, you're probably going to be borrowing roughly $1 million. It ends up being a little bit more than that, but just roughly $1 million if you've got a clean scenario. Now, that's 5 times. But if you have a $200,000 income and you increase it to $210,000, you find that $1 million borrowing capacity goes to about $1,075,000. Now, the reason for that being more than the 5 times figure is because the initial income everyone earns is all going to fund expenses. So if you make 50 grand a year, for example, that 50 grand is going to go to cover your entire living expense and all of the life costs that you have. You're going to have no leftover income. Meanwhile, a borrowing and a salary increase, quite often that is just all going straight to additional income you have available. It might not necessarily increase your expenses. In many cases, it doesn't increase your expenses on bank calculators too. So it means it just directly increases your net surplus available that you have. So that's why it has a higher multiple than salary income on its own. I've been asked that a couple of times, so I'm just adding some clarity to that and how that works. Awesome. Let's go through rental income. Rental income, a little bit less than salary income.
Yeah, so a bit less sensitive. Rents have been rising pretty rapidly recently, so it's a common question, but less powerful than salary, which disappoints a lot of people.
Yep.
But like, yeah, $100 increase in rental income, you're probably looking at roughly a 25K borrowing power increase. Banks, about 5X. So banks sensitize rental income more harshly than salary income. So 10K salary bump, you're getting 100% of that included. Like $100 a week rental income increase, depending on what lender, you're getting somewhere between $75 and $90 actually included as income on the calculator.
Yep.
Some banks also scale your rental property expenses based on the rental income at like a fixed rate. So an increase in rental income can push the expenses up a little bit with it. You still get a positive impact, but it reduces the kind of flow on effect. So you get some borrowing power boost, but unless you're seeing really, really significant changes in your rental situation, it'll give you a little boost. It's not going to change your world is normally how it plays out.
Okay, I realize we sound like massive nerds through this. I'm listening to you.
You can speak for yourself.
I'm like, what a nerd you are. Look at that. Like, here's how this calculator works. Here it is. I found this little secret to it. Now, that isn't a bad thing when you're looking for someone to work with, because understanding how lending calculators work and some of the nuances and niches to it can really help you expand things out, provide solutions to you when one bank says no. It's just understanding and breaking it all down into its really nuts and bolts, and then building it back up to the top level. It just helps break out a full understanding of how serviceability calculators work. And for property investors in particular, it really helps you work out how to get more money if that's something that is important for you. You can really break down the calculator and use it to your advantage. Anyway, let's go through number 5 here, expense increases. So this is when you are above the minimum living expenses that a bank takes. Let's just say you have $100 a week increase in your expenses. What does that do?
Yep, 60K reduction in borrowing power. So pretty big. So if you're sitting above the HEM kind
12X.
of level expense, every dollar of expense that you're adding on is hitting the borrowing power relatively hard.
Yeah.
This one, banks, depending on what the expenses are, banks treat it differently as well. So a common one is, private school fees, things like that. They can be very expensive, and a lot of banks will treat those as above HEM regardless of, or separate to HEM, like regardless of what your other day-to-day living expenses are. So that can result, I've seen, if you've got 3 kids in private school, that can be...
They're all being shifted to public school.
Kind of, or you're waiting until they graduate kind of thing. But that can be like several $100,000 in borrowing power that disappears as a result of those expenses.
So it's 12x in terms of the number. So rental salary income, 7.5x, rental income, 5x, expenses, 12x. Reason for that is because salary is pre-tax.
Yep.
So $10,000 increase. You got to pay tax on
Correct,
37% of that. So you get 7.5x. Rental income, there's tax on it. And then on top of that, there is a shading that banks take, and then additional expenses associated with getting more rental income, potentially rates notices and things like that go into it. Meanwhile, expenses, that's after tax dollars. So that is why it's got a much greater impact on your borrowing power.
Yeah. And this, I would just say the category of expense matters here. So not to nerd out again, but like someone I was speaking to yesterday, first home buyer, strata expenses get added in. Some banks add it in separately. Some banks don't. That creates like a 50K change in borrowing power, depending on how different banks treat it. So 100%. If you're just playing around and, your food costs go up $100 and your transport costs go down $100, then banks don't really care. But you have to be a little bit careful what category you're adding expenses in.
Yep. Whiz talk there from Kurt as well, breaking very, very specific things down. I'm learning from him right now. It's amazing. Interest-only loans. So why does an interest-only loan reduce your borrowing power?
Yes. So banks, when they're running the servicing for new debt, they're looking at the repayments that you make over the P&I term, plus the interest rate buffer. But say, for example, 30-year loan term, 5-year IO period, pretty common setup for an investor. Banks are looking at, okay, what are the monthly repayments going to be for you to pay this loan back over 25 years? Because the first 5 years, you're not paying down any principal. And that gets factored into the expense side of the servicing calculator. So that is going to be a higher expense than if you pay it back over 30 years because it's a longer time. So that's why the IO period reduces your servicing, aside from the fact that the interest rate might be a little bit higher, which can have an impact as well.
Yes.
But that's the general idea. So if you're looking at...
extrapolates to a smaller borrowing amount.
Exactly. So you may be looking at a 35K reduction on like a 500K loan if you choose 5-year IO. You can... It is, to nerd out a third time, it is possible on some bank calculators, the way that they flow the negative gearing through, that a 1-year IO period can have a very, very similar borrowing power to P&I. So if you really want interest only and you don't want to compromise your borrowing power.
Secrets.
Ugh. Yeah, because the way the negative gearing plays out, some banks will basically produce the same result.
Can you whisper the bank name?
No. We get in trouble? It's one of the major banks. So
it's okay. Say it out loud.
Won't take you that long to find it. But like 30-year P&I 20 versus 29-year P&I 1-year IO, they produce the same result. So if you're prepared to go for a short IO period, you can make it work. 5 years, little bit of a reduction.
Sure. That is very, very cool. I didn't know that. So 1 year interest only period, if you've got it there and you really want to preserve your borrowing power, but one interest only, and you can redo it again in a year's time, that could be a good little hack for you. Car leases. Okay, so I'm going to go through this one. Car leases have a bigger impact on your borrowing power than personal loans because, so if you're going and financing a car, you have a few different options. You have option one, cash, that is always best, has no impact on your borrowing power, or just about no impact. Personal loan, that will have an impact on your borrowing power because you're taking on debt that you can have to repay, and the expense that you have on that debt, that's going to reduce your borrowing power by that expense, multiplied by 12, roughly. Car leases, those are ugly because that monthly repayment that you have is much larger because they include all the maintenance, all the fuel costs, all these other costs that would otherwise go into the benchmark expense figure that a bank includes. Doesn't go in there. It actually goes in your car lease repayment, and the bank's going to be like, here's your HEM expense that we have. Let's include that. Plus, let's include your car lease expense, multiply it by the expense factoring, so roughly 12. And that really works out, depending on the type of car lease you have, it works out to be a $40,000 decrease to your borrowing power versus a personal loan. Versus cash, it's like a $100,000 plus increase plus change to your borrowing power. So car leases are a little bit nasty to your borrowing power, novated leases, things like that. Even though they say it's like really good for tax and you get a pre-tax, post-tax FBT benefit to it.
Yep.
Not so good for your borrowing power.
Yeah, does kind of trash your borrowing power a little bit. So that's a common one. Yeah.
Yeah. Sucks. We don't see them as often, do we? I don't see them that often.
There's a few. Yeah. We get it fairly regularly. And
people aren't listeing to us enough.
Well, I think a lot of people come to us with car leases and end up getting rid of them as they grow their portfolio. So, yeah.
Okay, the last one. I like this one. Babies.
Yeah, this is all your area of expertise.
Yes, my area of expertise with my two little babies that I have. They have reduced my borrowing power by $50,000 each. love you girls, but no thanks for the borrowing power impact. So
That's
this
all right.
works-
I was more worried when you put 50 there. That was like your estimate of like the cash expenditure per year. I was like, uh-oh. But okay, borrowing power reduction of 50K.
Well,
That's
it's a
slightly
bit
more
le-
manageable.
It's a bit less than that. I actually get asked that one a lot from closer friends and closer clients that do know me personally. They do ask me outside borrowing power questions. They want to know this bit, the 50K impact, but they also come to me and be like, how much does it actually cost? How much do I budget for when I have my first baby? What do I have to go and buy? And the general number that I have is 5K. Like, you just got to buy some stuff, and that stuff costs a bit of money. A pram costs, $500, I think. And then there's a whole bunch of things that you got to pay. So yeah, not 50, about 5.
All
In
right.
case you're
Good to
wondering.
know.
In case you're
Yeah.
wondering, Curtis is getting married this year, so that is probably why he's asking me.
Yeah. How much? Can I get the hand-me-downs from you?
Yes.
That'll actually, I'll cut this.
Yeah.
Cut this budget down.
Yeah, you can.
I'll take the borrowing power
I don't-
hit. I don't want the cash outflow.
I don't think I'll need it when you have kids. So yeah, that is cool. So babies have a 50K impact on your borrowing power, but really it's not the expense side. So this is the expense measurement, but it's not the expense side that really impacts your borrowing power. Most people we find have different circumstances when they return to the workforce. So if you take time off and you can provide a return to work letter, you plan on going back to work full time, within 12-ish months or so, you can have the same income included in your borrowing power. But we find a lot of families go back with slightly different work arrangements during their family planning, during the younger years of children's lives. So quite often people go back 4 days a week, which can reduce your borrowing power by a significant amount. Quite often people scale up the time that they go back. So they start at 3 days, and then go to 4 days, then go to 5 days. But if you start at 3 days and you apply for a loan at that time, the bank is going to take your 3-day pay rate into account, not the 5-day pay rate, even if you plan on going to full time. So there's an income impact as well, but that really will depend on the specifics of your situation and how you balance it. The best way to kind of guide that is go back to the income metric that we just talked about earlier and be like, how much income have I lost here from this circumstance? And then take that away from your borrowing power. And then the baby impact, about 50K, and you work out that that's my change in borrowing power. So yeah, has a little bit of an impact.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
Pretty big one.
Yeah, I think we've run through 8 or 9 there.
Yeah.
Pretty useful ones. So yeah, I would say in summary, you've got some of the multiples that you can just kind of times the difference by. So like, income maybe 7, expenses 12 to do a quick back of the envelope calculation. But then for some of these categories, particularly when you're getting into stuff that involves investment properties like rents and things like that, you might benefit from going and finding yourself like a nerd to actually open up the spreadsheet for you and get you answers.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of variation in here. These are just general benchmarks to help you make some quick decisions back of the envelope to help you decide between things. Sometimes if you're at a car dealership and you're there and you got 50K cash and you're like, I want to buy a property next year, being like, how do I do this? Is there a better way to do it? Perhaps I can take out equity in my property rather than get a personal loan or car lease. Education helps you make better decisions. And that's what this podcast is all about, educating you about the financial consequences of the decisions you and your family are thinking about so you can make better decisions and choose to do what you want to do with this insight in mind.